Alrighty. My, this class of students is increasing in numbers all the time. It's like we're reproducing or something. And that touches on our topic for today. You have come to Menopause University, where I teach you everything you need to know for success in managing your menopause your way. I'm Menopause Taylor, a retired gynecologist who is on a mission to educate women about menopause. And as you know, I cover everything in units. No jumping around randomly from one topic to another here. There's just no way to learn anything with a disorderly approach like that. And watching my videos in order, starting from the very first one, is critical if you want to actually understand everything. So this is video number 374. It's the 19th video in the unit on breast cancer. And we are making our way through all the risk factors for breast cancer, one video at a time. This particular video is on your reproductive risk factors for breast cancer. Now, if you're wondering what in the world constitutes a reproductive risk factor, you need to keep watching. It will be crystal clear to you by the end of this video. If you have my book, either the first or the second edition, you will find this material in chapter 30. It's ideal to watch all the videos in order and follow along in the book. So let's begin by defining what constitutes a reproductive risk factor. Reproductive risk factors are all the aspects of your reproductive life that can have an effect on your risk for breast cancer. They include the age at which you had your first period, which is called menarche, the age at which you had your first full-term or near-term pregnancy, the number of pregnancies you've had, how many months you breastfed, and the age at which you became post-menopausal. So you can see that all these things have to do with some aspect of reproduction. But how do they affect your risk for breast cancer? And do they all affect your risk for breast cancer in the same way? To get you thinking about these questions, see if you can answer this quiz question. Which of these statements is an accurate reflection of the effect of your reproductive life on your risk for breast cancer? A, the later you had your first period, the higher your risk of breast cancer. B, the fewer pregnancies you've had, the lower your risk of breast cancer. C, the fewer months you breastfed, the lower your risk of breast cancer. D, the later your menopause, the lower your risk of breast cancer. E, the fewer menstrual cycles you've had, the lower your risk of breast cancer. F, all of the above. G, none of the above. H, A and C above. I, B and D above. Did you nail it? If you've been watching my videos in order, you very well may have. I've planted the seed for this lesson in previous videos. That's how a real education works. It's a lot like writing a good novel. You plant a seed and then you bring it to fruition later on. So this video will bring together all these things that constitute the effect of your reproductive life on your risk of breast cancer. So here's the quiz question again with the answer in bold. All right, let's address each of these factors one at a time, and we'll do so in order of occurrence. So menarche is first. Menarche is defined as your first menstrual cycle or first period. So menarche marks the time when you begin your reproductive life. It's the central event of puberty. Way back in video 6, I taught you that menopause is puberty in reverse. So puberty is when you have your first period, and postmenopause is when you have your last period. Or another way to say this is that menarche is when you start your periods, and postmenopause is when you stop your periods. Well, it turns out that the younger you were when you had your very first period, the higher your risk for breast cancer. Studies on this compared teens younger than 12 to teens older than 16 at the time of menarche. But even with that big a gap in the age range for menarche, the degree of contribution to your risk for breast cancer does not have a large effect. When I say it does not have a large effect, I mean it does not increase your risk by a factor of at least 3. I taught you about the phenomenon of a large effect in video number 366 on risk. And if you compare the rate of breast cancer in women who experience menarche at an age younger than 12 to women who experienced menarche at an age over 16, the difference, or relative risk, is only 1.1 to 1.4. This means that in and of itself, early menarche does not have much of an effect on your risk for breast cancer. The second reproductive factor is your age when you had your first full-term or near-term pregnancy. And with regard to your risk of breast cancer, the older you were when you had your first full-term or near-term pregnancy, the higher your risk of breast cancer. Studies comparing the rate of breast cancer between women who had their first full-term or near-term pregnancy before age 20 and women who had their first full-term or near-term pregnancy after age 35 reveal a difference, or relative risk, of 1.5 to 2.9. So this means that waiting until after age 20 to have your first full-term or near-term pregnancy increases your risk of breast cancer over the average risk of 1 in 7. And this has a greater effect on your risk for breast cancer than does early menarche, with the range for the difference being greater too. Now, why do you think your age for your first full-term or near-term pregnancy matters? I mean, face it, pregnancy is pregnancy. What's the difference between having your first full-term or near-term pregnancy at 20 versus 40? I want you to let that thought linger for a bit, and we're going to move on to the other reproductive factors. I think this will make more sense to you once you've learned how each of these factors contributes to your risk of breast cancer. The third reproductive risk factor for breast cancer is the number of pregnancies you've had. And here's how this affects your risk for breast cancer. The fewer pregnancies you've had, the higher your risk of breast cancer. So if you were infertile or never had children, your risk is higher than if you are like the old lady who lived in the shoe and had so many children you didn't know what to do. So now you see that it's not only how early you start having pregnancies, but also how many you have that impacts your risk of breast cancer. And the later you start, or the fewer you have, the higher your risk. And shortly, you'll discover that it's the time you spent being pregnant that matters. A full-term pregnancy is 10 months, not 9 months. So if you're calculating how long you were pregnant, use 10 months for each full-term pregnancy. Studies comparing breast cancer rates between women who have never been pregnant and women who have had just one full-term or near-term pregnancy reveal a difference, or relative risk, of 1.1 to 1.4. Of course, that does not take into account a greater number of pregnancies than just one. All it does is compare 0 pregnancies to one pregnancy. And shortly you'll see that such a comparison is inadequate. But that's all the studies have compared. The fourth reproductive risk factor for breast cancer is how many months you spent breastfeeding. Breastfeeding, it affects your risk for breast cancer. The fewer months you spent breastfeeding, the higher your risk. So if you were an earth mother who breastfed your kids until they went to first grade, you decreased your risk quite a bit. But if you bottle fed exclusively and never breastfed, you did not decrease your risk at all. And actually, most of the studies on this particular risk factor merely compare breastfeeding with no breastfeeding, instead of comparing the duration of breastfeeding. Studies comparing rates of breast cancer between women who breastfed more than 12 months with those who breastfed fewer than 12 months reveal a difference or relative risk of 0.7 to 0.8. The fact that these numbers are less than 1 means that you actually decrease your risk of breast cancer lower than the average risk of 1 in 7 by breastfeeding for more than 12 months. And finally, the fifth reproductive risk factor for breast cancer is your age at the time you became post-menopausal. Notice that this pertains to post-menopause, not perimenopause. So you may have been perimenopausal for 10 years, and that does not impact your risk for breast cancer one way or the other. What matters is when you stopped having periods forever and became post-menopausal. And it turns out that the later you became post-menopausal, the higher your risk of breast cancer. Studies comparing women who became post-menopausal before the age of 40 with women who became post-menopausal after the age of 40 reveal a difference or relative risk of 0.5. And once again, because this number is less than 1, it means that becoming post-menopausal before the age of 40 actually decreases your risk of breast cancer below the average risk of 1 in 7. So let's look at all these factors collectively. If we make a chart of these reproductive risk factors, it will help us elucidate the underlying principle as to why these things affect your risk of breast cancer. So all I've done here thus far is list our 5 reproductive risk factors for breast cancer in the first column. And then in the second green column, I've listed how they decrease your risk of breast cancer. And then in the third red column, I've listed how they increase your risk of breast cancer. Now looking at that chart, can you detect any common thread that ties all of these factors together and accounts for whether each one increases or decreases your risk of breast cancer? This requires you to detect what they all have in common. Any ideas? Well, they all affect how many menstrual cycles you have during your reproductive life. If I add a column for the impact on the number of menstrual cycles that each factor imparts, you'll see the pattern. Now, you clearly see that all the reproductive risk factors that decrease your risk for breast cancer result in fewer menstrual cycles. And all the reproductive risk factors that increase your risk for breast cancer result in more menstrual cycles. So the real culprit here that increases your risk for breast cancer is having more menstrual cycles. And anything that causes you to have fewer menstrual cycles or interrupts your menstrual cycles decreases your risk. So this leads us to something called your menstrual life. Your menstrual life is an equation for calculating the number of menstrual cycles you've had during your lifetime. It's a very easy calculation as follows. All you do is start with your age at postmenopause. From your postmenopausal age, subtract your age when you had your first period. Then multiply that by 13. You multiply by 13 because you actually have 13 menstrual cycles each calendar year, not 12. Then you subtract from that the number of months you were pregnant, using 10 months for each term pregnancy. And just subtract 1 month for each month of prematurity if you had a near-term pregnancy. And then you subtract from that the total number of months you breastfed. And the answer is your menstrual life. Once you have the number representing your menstrual life, there's a scale for what constitutes low risk, high risk, and very high risk. If your answer is fewer than 350 menstrual cycles in your lifetime, you have a low risk for breast cancer based on your menstrual life. If your answer is between 350 and 450 menstrual cycles in your lifetime, you have a high risk for breast cancer based on your menstrual life. And if your answer is more than 450 menstrual cycles in your lifetime, you have a very high risk for breast cancer based on your menstrual life. Here are some examples of how this plays out. Let's say example 1 is, let's say you became postmenopausal at age 49, had your first period at age 15, had your first full-term pregnancy at age 20, had 8 full-term pregnancies, and breastfed each child for 12 months, totaling 96 months. Your menstrual life would total 266, making you low risk for breast cancer. And here's how that calculation would look. For example number 2, let's say you became postmenopausal at age 51, had your first period at age 11, had your first full-term pregnancy at age 32, had 3 full-term pregnancies, and breastfed each child for 18 months, totaling 54 months. Your menstrual life would be a total of 436, making you high risk for breast cancer. And here's how that calculation would look. For example 3, let's say you became postmenopausal at age 56, had your first period at age 10, have never been pregnant, and obviously have never breastfed. Well, your menstrual life would total 598, making you very high risk. And here's how that calculation would look. So with these 3 examples, you see that the younger you are when you have your first period, the older you are at postmenopause, the older you are when you have your first full-term or near-term pregnancy, the fewer pregnancies you have, and the shorter time you breastfeed, the higher your risk for breast cancer. But what if your situation is unusual? What if you experienced premature menopause? Take a look at one more example. For example number 4, let's say you became postmenopausal at age 34, had your first period at age 14, have never been pregnant, and obviously have never breastfed. Your menstrual life would total 260, making you very low risk. And here's how that calculation looks. So while the number of pregnancies you've had and the length of time you breastfed matters, what really matters, more than anything, is how many menstrual cycles you've had in your lifetime. The woman in example 4 had no pregnancies or breastfeeding, but still had a very low risk of breast cancer based on her menstrual life. So with these examples, you see that the older you are when you have your first period, the younger you are at postmenopause, the younger you are when you have your first full-term or near-term pregnancy, and the more pregnancies you had and the longer time you breastfeed, the lower your risk for breast cancer. If we make a little chart of the relative risk for each of these reproductive risk factors for breast cancer, you can compare their degrees of impact. This simple chart has just 3 columns. The first column designates each of the reproductive risk factors that increase your risk for breast cancer. Early age at menarche, late age at first full-term or near-term pregnancy, few or no pregnancies, few or no months of breastfeeding, and late age at postmenopause. The second column defines the parameters according to the studies that have been done on each risk factor. And the third column designates the relative increase in risk compared to women without that particular risk factor. And if we plug this into our big chart of risk factors, we get this. Now you see that I've added the relative risk for each of these reproductive risk factors. And notice that I've converted the relative risk ratios into percentages to conform to the other risk figures in this chart. I think it's helpful to see it both ways. And you see that not a single one of these reproductive risk factors all by itself carries a high risk. But together, in terms of your overall menstrual life, they can increase or decrease your risk by about 7%. So it's cycles that matter. Well, if it's cycles that increase your risk for breast cancer, what is it about cycles that increases your risk? And that's what we'll dissect in the next video. So what you've learned here today is that your risk for breast cancer increases with the number of menstrual cycles you've had in your lifetime. Therefore, reproductive histories that result in fewer cycles decrease your risk for breast cancer. These include older age at your first period, younger age at first term or near-term pregnancy, more pregnancies, more months of breastfeeding, and younger age at postmenopause. On the contrary, reproductive histories that result in more cycles increase your risk for breast cancer. These include younger age at first period, older age at first full-term or near-term pregnancy, fewer pregnancies, fewer months of breastfeeding, and older age at postmenopause. And as usual, you can find all 3 charts I showed in this video in the description box link or at menopausetailored.me. So be sure to come back for the continuation of this topic next week. It will bring all you've learned today full circle. In the meantime, go to menopausetailored.me, browse around, read some of the fun articles I've written and posted there, see the educational resources I have on my online store, and don't expect to find any menopause management products per se, because I'm all about the education. Schedule a consultation so that I can tailor everything specifically to you. Subscribe here before you leave today, and look for me on Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, and Stories. Bye!